Hello, Siobhan here. Thanks for watching part 2 of Making Meaning from Trauma. This is a quick catch-up for those of you who haven't listened to part 1. If you haven't and you want to, please go back and listen to it. We talked about the difference between how you receive meaning in your life from all the things that happen to you. They're related to your beliefs, they're related to your goals, they're related to the meaningfulness or your feelings about what happens. That can be traumatic events, but it can also be your day-to-day lives, normal encounters, your family interactions, what you think is about justice, predictability of life, the amount of control you have in the world. All these things really tie into what we believe about ourselves and the things that happen to us, and even how we compare the things that happen to us versus the things that happen to someone else. And a lot of that will come together nicely when we talk about situational meaning and how you help process things that happen to you in the context of your mind. Hopefully that helps. If it doesn't and you're still confused, I really recommend you going back and listening to part 1 before listening to part 2. Either way, if you like what you hear, please don't forget to like this video. You can comment, and looking for 3 people listening to subscribe. So will that be you? Okay, let's get into it. Let's talk about situational meaning. So again, that's the context of your environment, and it begins with the actual occurrence of an event that could be stressful, and it describes an ongoing set of processes and outcomes, including the assignment of meaning to an event or the appraised meaning of an event. We're going to go through appraised meaning first. But your situation ultimately gives you a determination of those discrepancies between what you appraise a meaning to be and the global meaning. So it has to do with the things around what you expect and assign meaning to versus how you experience meaning in your feelings, in your thoughts, and your goals. Let's break that down. Appraised meaning in the situational sense is the implicit meaning. Implicit meaning is instantaneous. It is your first thought. It is your gut reaction. And it's ever evolving. It has the potential to never stop, never stopping. Don't quit. Can't stop, won't stop. In the sense that you have this idea that meaning is one thing, and you may be perfectly fine with that meaning that you've assigned to it. But then something could happen that changes your belief system, that shifts your experience, and therefore it has the potential to change what you think the next time about something when it instantly happens. And that can be for the good or the bad if we're assigning those judgments to it, because we don't have to. But as humans, we tend to do good, do bad. That's the conscience in us. So that is implicit meaning. It's instant and it's ongoing, and it has the potential to evolve forever until the end of your time. Examples of a determination of meaning is the extent to which you were threatened or felt that the event was controllable. Going back to the bear sighting, I was not threatened because I, weirdly enough, have been around enough black bears to be like, there is less potential that this black bear will not bother me, especially if there are not cubs around. And I have this dog. I have a miniature pinscher who's like 12 years old. So ultimately, I think if Miles and the bear had a fight, Miles would not be on the winning end of this. But he makes enough noise, and bears tend to not like noise. And I know that brown bears are usually looking for trash. Black bears. Sorry, brown bears or grizzlies, those are more dangerous than the black bears that are around here in the city. But if it's, in general, I have enough information, enough schema over my 5 years of living here and the 3 years I was in Montana before then. Now, before that, I had zero experience with bears, and I probably would have been freaked out if I saw this black bear a mere 10 feet from me. So that's the example of the extent in which you felt threatened. I did not feel threatened by this bear where I was shivering in my boots and could not keep moving. And then the event was controllable. Like, again, I just listed off all these reasons as to why I believed that if I just turned around and walked back to my house, this bear who I saw walking away was not going to miraculously decide to come run after me and attack me. These type of situations, which are more common to us, I still laugh that I'm saying that me seeing a bear is common because it's crazy, right? But the extent to which our everyday experiences lead us to have a good sense of predictability and therefore don't trigger those trauma responses. So for me with this bear, it was meaningful in the sense that I know that most people don't experience black bears this often, but as a Alaska resident, it's not as meaningful to me. The new person visiting Alaska is visiting differently and probably would think this is like a very cool situation. So therefore, as I'm talking to you about it, I'm figuring you probably don't have the same experience as I do with bears, and therefore you would find a lot more significance or meaning in this story, whether that be entertainment value or shock and awe. Not necessarily this fulfillment, this meaningful feeling of fulfillment, but for entertainment purposes, for enjoyment, for a good time, a nice conversation, it does have a significance. The next thing you want to do when you're looking at a praise meaning, situational meaning, is focusing on the discrepancies between the global beliefs, feelings, and goals, and the gap that it has to get to what you appraise, what your implicit reaction of what this meaning is to you. Violations of expectations of beliefs and behaviors generate an intense motivation to decrease stress and reduce the discrepancy. That is, if it wasn't predictable, well, hindsight is 20/20. So then you start getting into the shoulda, woulda, couldas. And depending on how traumatic, how much of a negative impact that had on your life, if you can't reconcile that sometimes we just don't have control, most times we don't have control over a situation, and then figuring out, well, what does that mean for me? How am I going to move on now knowing that this terrible thing happened? So going back to the black bear, not brown bear. Going back to the I'm doing it again. It's a black bear. Black bears are smaller. Brown bears are like these big grizzlies. They're a lot more intense. But had, for some reason, I mistakenly thought it was a black bear and it ended up being a brown bear and start charging after me for some reason and decided that my Aunt Miles looked like a tasty treat, that would be very difficult for me to reconcile after my attack. And then, of course, it would be like this crazy freak accident, and who knows how my parents and my loved ones would have responded to this event that happened that they now have to deal with. Like, who would have thought that a random brown bear that was mistakenly thought of as a black bear in the middle of the city in a crowded neighborhood, you got attacked? Like, those are things that don't start to make sense. And having to reconcile that discrepancy can cause a big problem if you're trying to make meaning out of it, because it's senseless. Why hadn't anyone caught this brown bear? Why was Siobhan walking her dog at 10 o'clock at night? Then you start trying to make meaning out of the situation, which is the next step. You've acknowledged your immediate appraisal. You've pinpointed all the discrepancies between what happened and what you expected to happen. And then the next part of it is then making meaning. The process of making meaning involves the idea that recovering from a stressful event evolves and starts reducing the discrepancies between the initial thoughts, the actual outcomes, and what you wished could have ultimately happened, like if you could wave a magic wand. So these are still more deliberate because you're now processing. You're now taking your thoughts, comparing it to new information, and it takes some dynamics, some juggling, because you are actually taking the time to acknowledge what you automatically thought and deliberate and think about what could have happened, why it could have happened, what this means. You're taking that information and you're mixing it in and call it a process of assimilation. I'm going to do a weird reference that you may or may not get. But whenever I think of assimilation, I think of the Borg from Star Trek. And it's this idea that they take things that existed on their own and turn them into a hive mind by plugging them into the computer, which is the Borg. So we are the Borg. It's really the best example I can give of assimilation. If I can find a clip on YouTube, I promise I will put it in the show notes. But if I cannot, then go down streaming and find some episodes of Star Trek: The Next Generation and just have fun. It's an awesome show. And then the next step of that, or other pieces of processing it, making meaning, is searching for the comprehensibility, big word, too many syllables, but ultimately make it make sense. You're making it make sense for you, right? The difference between fact and fiction is that, reality and fiction is that fiction does not, so let's go back. In college, I had this t-shirt that I was given because I had a ridiculous amount of free t-shirts in college. And here's a fun fact. Yes, you can go to like a big school. So I've been to like tiny universities. I've been to community colleges. I've went to large football schools, Go Noles, Florida State. But I will say I've been to private universities as well, like with nuns walking around, Catholic school. Like I've been to various different higher education institutions. But when I went to the University of North Florida, I had the best quality of free shirt collections that I have ever had. And one of those shirts that I had said the difference between reality and fiction is that fiction has to make sense. And that has stuck with me all these years because ultimately, growing up as a kid, you're always asking why. You're always trying to figure out why things happen. And some parents are really good at making stuff up. And as kids, we believe everything our parents say. And sometimes you just dismiss and move on because it doesn't really matter and you don't have an answer. But when you're dealing with the meaning-making process, it really is this idea of taking old information, taking new information, and mixing them all together so that it does start to make sense. And then there's an accommodation factor too, where you kind of like create space in your brain to insert new information that may not quite fit, but it fits enough to relieve this anxiety or pressure or tension that you're feeling, and you move on. And it may never come back up again, and then something could happen and you have to readdress it. All this to say, the making meaning process is also one that is ever evolving. And then you also are really looking at the difference between your thoughts and your emotions. And a lot of times we don't take the time to pay attention to the difference between the two because they're so much related. Your thoughts, behaviors, and actions are all interrelated, but we don't often take the time to separate the difference between how we actually feel and what we are actually thinking. So let's go into automatic versus deliberate a little bit more in detail. Automatic is the unconscious processing. Deliberate is the effort to deal with the situation with coping strategies to decrease the globally appraised. So those again are your thoughts, your goals, your outcomes, your feelings, and the meaning discrepancy that is generating distress in you. Some strategies specifically for utilizing methods to help you bridge the gap between automatic and deliberate processes are using positive reappraisal. Think happy thoughts about the situation. A lot of times when we're in distress, we are not in a place of happiness. We're not in a place of joy. We're not in a place of positivity. And therefore, we cannot think of positive outcomes. There is usually some glimmer of hope. There's usually some inkling of sunshine in terrible situations. Why? Because if everyone was in constant states of distress, nobody would get anything accomplished. Everyone would be miserable. Life would be terribly hellful for everyone. And so it is important to make positive and reappraisals. Sometimes you have to get yourself in a space where you can get in a state of positivity, but just know circumstances, options open up once you start thinking about positive outcomes. Also, revising your goals and planning goal-directed things that are problem-solving, are problem-focused. Looking at the problem for solutions as opposed to looking at the situation or your feelings. You're really honing in on what can I actually change. Last episode, I talked about how I had to move my garage with no help and a very tight window. If I had sat in that negativity, woe is me, I can't get this done, and actually looked at how the actual problem, I need to get this stuff out of the garage. How can I make that happen? I wouldn't be able to make goal-directed steps if I had not focused on the actual problem and not how I felt about the problem. And then a lot of times there's a reason why people turn to spiritual practices, religion, God, because that is a great strategy for learning that there are things in this world that are beyond our comprehension, and having some kind of relationship with the higher power. That's why AA uses the serenity prayer, because it shifts away from the task of I can't figure anything out because everything is unpredictable, and allows you to move on a sense of faith and reflection that there are things outside of our control, but we still manage to get tough things done. And that could be because of a higher power. And I say that for myself, because when I personally lean into my religious principles and my spirituality and my relationship with God, I often have a sense of lightness that happens over me, and it also helps me make more sense, more meaning out of the larger things that happen to me. I want to thank Military Veterans in Journalism for sponsoring this season of the Armed with Ambition podcast. This organization is amazing. I've been a part of it for over 2 years now, and the work that they do to not only make sure that veterans' stories are told and military issues, but to create a community and provide job opportunities is amazing. I would encourage everyone to check out their website, see what wonderful things they have going on, and you'd be surprised at how storytelling falls into journalism. Thanks again, military veterans in journalism, for your support of our show. Comprehensivity is a word that we use when we're really just trying to say, does it make sense? Does it make sense to me based on what I know? When we grow up, we go to school and it teaches us things, and those things integrate into our brain on how we learn about the world. Like I like to say, whether it be education or the school of hard knocks, it still are things that happen to us that we've absorbed, and it helps us make meaning of situations, and therefore we respond. Versus finding meaning in significance, it's determining the value or worth of an event. Like, people don't like random acts of violence or when something bad happens to good people because we've assigned that it wasn't worth it. The loss, the tragedy that was experienced was not worth the result of no longer having that person or have lost the essence of who that person was, because there was the significance of that life is no longer there. That potential for more has been taken away. That measure of, was this senseless? Did it make sense? And what was the significance or importance? That is also a key in figuring out the meaning-making process, because it has a lot to do with how we process what happened emotionally. It has this idea of, do we live in a fair, just world? And if we don't live in a fair, just world, what does that mean for my life and the people I care about? That's a deep question. It's actually too deep for me to keep talking about it in this podcast. We may talk about that more in a future episode, but I do want you to ponder how you've addressed situations in the past where you've had to make sense out of nonsense, and if having significance or assigning an amount of value to what happened, how that has shifted your ability to accept what has happened and find new meaning on the why it happened. So that is a key piece of emotional processing, but it's also a key piece in cognitive processing. And ultimately, you are playing with these ideas of, how do my thoughts affect? Cognitive is your thinking. It's your brain power. So when you're looking at cognitive and emotional meaning making, you're looking at the interaction between the two, how that they impact outcomes, how they impact your actions. And mainly with cognitive processes, you're reworking your beliefs specifically, going back to how you've shaped what has happened to you, what your beliefs are, what your thoughts are about different key topics in the world, how justice plays into that. That is looking at, am I in a just world? Was this right? Was this wrong? Did this make sense? And then again, taking the time to notice the feelings that start to come up when you think about these more complex and abstract thoughts, and then continuing when those abstract thoughts start to get a little bit too crazy. A lot of times when we think about things that don't make us feel good, we shut down and we're just like, F it, and we move on to something else. But when you're processing, you're trusting yourself, you're trusting your capacity to think about it a little bit longer and try to have some resolution in the feelings, and knowing that those uncomfortable feelings aren't wrong, and then trusting yourself to be able to handle emotions that come up, Because a lot of times your understanding is just on the other side of getting that cry out, is on the other side of doing that like ugly boo-hoo crying and emotional release, that yelling. A lot of times, as soon as we're done experiencing that uncomfortableness, the thing that we've been working so hard to keep inside us and tied up, a new sense of understanding has happened because all of your energy and brain power has been working to keep that emotion at bay, when really it's just part of the natural process of understanding and learning more about yourself, others, and the world. So once you've worked on processing meaning by doing those things, you then want to resolve. So basically decide that for now, you have come to some kind of conclusion about this whole situation. It's the sense of having made sense. You finally made it make sense. There's a sense of acceptance that you don't always have control over things. Things are unpredictable. Bad things happen to bad people. And the reattribution, or adjusting what you attributed, so reasons or circumstances or outcomes to, and understanding the cause of the event, which can sometimes be like, we don't really know why it happens. We think this is what happened, but sometimes that's good enough. Like those unsolved mysteries. It's the acceptance that not everything's going to be resolved, and that sometimes your best guess is good enough. And the understanding that there could be more information later that brings a resolution. But if there is not, that's also okay, because you have a choice to not let the unknown negatively impact your experience of the now. Because the right now is known because you're experiencing it in the moment. And ultimately, you would get a new set of beliefs or a more refined version of an original belief. Because again, you're taking general information, and through this process, you're making it a bit more specific, a bit more curtailed to the situation or event that you've just experienced. So there you have it. That is a long version of the process to making meaning out of life. And this conversation started out of me having to grapple with the idea that my meaning was defined by what I did and not who I was. I was a social worker. Who are you? I am the social work ethics. Then when I joined the Air Force, my social work ethics did not quite fit in with what the Air Force thought a social worker should be doing. And it didn't fit for me. And because I had not had a firm grasp on my why behind what I was doing for things, I was easily swayed to make decisions that I wasn't always happy with about myself, because I wanted to make other people have more faith in me, or other people see me as the leader that I thought I was before I joined the military. And then that all got shook up because other people can't necessarily define who you are as a leader. You stand in what's important to you, and those values are based on the meaning that you give your actions and are grounded in your purpose. So if you're having a hard time dealing with a traumatic event, or an event that really is significantly impacting how you function in the world and live your day-to-day life, I just want to briefly go over the steps again for processing and making meaning out of a situation. First, you're going to look at the appraised meaning. That's your initial, instantaneous thoughts about what the circumstance or event means to you and other people, knowing that it's ever evolving and ever changing. Then the next step would be look at the discrepancies between your appraised meaning and your global meaning. And remember, global meaning is the beliefs, thoughts, and feelings of meaningfulness behind that situation or event. You're looking at violations of what you thought should happen versus what actually did happen. Step 3 is the actual making meaning process once you've figured out those discrepancies. You've recovered from the stressful event, and now you're really looking at what you automatically thought would happen versus using the strategies to deliberate and understand by beginning in a positive space and then reevaluating the situation. Considering different goals and planning for future outcomes based on your new information. And if you choose, using your spiritual guidance to look at a greater sense of meaning or purpose. Also, you're looking at your thought process for your beliefs. Are you assimilating new information? Are you accommodating information into what you already believe? And then in the same process, you're looking at your emotions and how they're affected by your thoughts. And you're wondering, what was the significance or the value behind this happen? Can I find a way to make this event make sense when it seems incomprehensible? And then the fourth step is looking at your results from all this processing and understanding and seeing what level of acceptance you have with the event and if there are any lessons to be learned for moving forward, and identifying ways in which you can create a better future for yourself given this situation and the changes that it's made within you. And remember, ultimately, your meaning is the why behind what you do, and it's not always consistent with the why behind the person who's assigned you that goal or action. So when you're looking at ways to find meaning in the world, meaning in yourself, meaning in things that happen, take a step back and compare what you thought should have happened, what you wished would have been a better outcome, and think to yourself, is there any reason that I can bring to this situation that can uplift myself and others? Because I don't deserve to be miserable and unhappy over things that are ultimately beyond my control or have inevitably happened despite me not wanting it to. Thank you very much for joining me on this episode of Armed with Ambition. I'm your host, Siobhan Cunningham. I'll talk to you next time.